My name's Ryan, and if you've ever wondered what it feels like to be the extra piece in your own family's puzzle, let me tell you, it's like being invited to your own funeral every Sunday and told to smile through it. My parents never hit me. They never screamed, but every sentence they spoke was a blade wrapped in politeness. And every comparison to my sister Emily was a reminder that I was a draft they wished they could erase. Emily was the golden one. Perfect grades, perfect smile, the kind of person who could trip over her own ego and still land in applause. And me? I was the quiet one, the afterthought, the he's doing his best trophy they polished only when guests asked about me. I learned early that love in our house was conditional, that praise was a currency only Emily could afford. I used to think one day I'd earn it, that if I worked hard enough, they'd finally look at me the way they looked at her, but that day never came. Instead came the family party, the one that detonated the illusion completely. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. It was supposed to be a celebration for my dad's 60th birthday. Everyone was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins, old neighbors who still thought I was 10, and the air smelled like barbecue and fake affection. I arrived with a small gift, nothing fancy, just something thoughtful, an engraved pocket watch I'd saved up for, because Dad loved old things, and I thought maybe for once he'd see that I knew him. Emily swept in 20 minutes later wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and everyone cheered like Beyoncé had entered the room. Mom hugged her so tight I thought she might fuse into her and said, "Our pride and joy is here," and Dad laughed. The star of the family has arrived, and I stood there holding the damn watch, invisible in plain sight. Dinner started, and the jokes flew. Stories about Emily's achievements, her promotions, her vacations, her boyfriend who worked in finance and probably called his parents just to hear them clap. I tried to join in, to add something, but every time I opened my mouth someone talked over me, like my volume was permanently stuck on mute. At one point Aunt Linda asked my parents how they felt having such successful kids, and Dad smiled, glanced at me, and said, "Well, we wish Emily was our only child, but what can you do?" Everyone laughed, like it was a joke, like those words didn't slice straight through me. And Emily smirked, that tiny, smug twist of her mouth I'd seen 100 times growing up, the one that said, "I win again." My mother added, "He knows we're kidding," and patted my arm like I was a pet learning tricks too slowly. I just sat there, staring at the tablecloth, hearing the laughter echo in my skull like a broken record. I didn't cry. Not then, not later, because tears were too small a weapon for what they'd done. I just smiled politely, said, "Excuse me," and walked out into the night air that felt colder than I remembered. Behind me, I heard my cousin whisper, "Is he mad?" And someone laughed, "Ryan's sensitive." And that was the last thing I heard before the door shut. I drove home in silence, the road lights flashing like an old film reel, every memory replaying, birthdays forgotten, achievements ignored, every maybe next time carved into my ribs like tally marks. When I got home, I didn't throw things or scream. I just sat down and wrote a list, not of revenge, not yet, but of truth. Every way they'd made me feel small, every time they'd chosen Emily over me, every apology I'd given just to keep peace. And somewhere around 3 a.m., as the list got longer, the hurt turned into something else, clarity. If they wanted a life without me, they could have it. I'd spent my whole existence trying to be part of a family that had already decided I didn't belong, and for the first time, I decided to give them what they always wanted, distance. The next morning, I sent a polite text. "Hey, I'll be stepping back from family events for a while. Need to focus on myself. Take care." Mom replied, "Don't be dramatic." Dad sent nothing. Emily sent a laughing emoji. I turned off my phone, blocked their numbers, deleted the family chat, and for the first time, silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Over the next days, I started cleaning my apartment, deleting old photos, removing traces of them like pruning a dying tree so something else could grow. At work, I stopped apologizing for existing and started asking for what I deserved, and people listened. Turns out, when you stop trying to be liked, you start being respected. I thought that was the end of the story, but life has this strange timing, and 1 week later, I got a call from a lawyer I barely remembered, my grandfather's attorney. Grandpa had passed years ago, but apparently his estate had been locked in probate because of some land dispute, and it had finally cleared. "Mr. Cole," the lawyer said, "your grandfather left you his house and property in Ashridge." I blinked. "Wait, just me?" And he said, Yes, just you. His will was quite specific. I couldn't even process it. Grandpa, the one who used to sneak me cookies when Mom wasn't looking, the only one who ever said, "You're different." And that's a good thing. He'd left me everything. The house, the land, even a small trust fund for upkeep. I drove there that weekend. A quiet old house surrounded by trees, sunlight spilling through the windows like forgiveness itself. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not Emily, not yet, because part of me wanted to see what would happen when they realized the one they wished away had inherited the thing they all thought they deserved. That night, sitting in Grandpa's old armchair, I poured myself a glass of his favorite whiskey and said out loud, "You always saw me, didn't you?" And in the quiet creak of the house, it almost felt like he answered. I decided then that I wouldn't use this gift to gloat. Not yet, but I also wouldn't hide it when the truth eventually came out. Because some lessons life teaches with words, and some with absence. The week after the party, I kept my distance completely. No calls, no texts, no visits. And soon the messages started turning from annoyance to worry. "Ryan, call us. Where are you? Stop being childish." And finally, "If you keep this up, don't expect us to come crawling." And I smile because they still didn't understand. I wasn't waiting for them to crawl. I was walking away for good. I spent my days fixing up the house, repainting walls, restoring furniture, and with every brushstroke, I felt the weight of their voices fading. One night, as I sat on the porch watching the stars over Ashridge, I realized I didn't hate them anymore. I just didn't care. And that was worse for them than any revenge I could plan. Because soon, they'd realize what they'd lost. Not a son to mock, but the only person who ever loved them enough to stay despite the pain. I didn't need to lift a finger. Life was already writing their downfall, and the ink was dry. The silence lasted longer than I expected, and honestly, it was beautiful. No constant criticism, no backhanded compliments, no reminders that I was the family's disappointment. Just quiet mornings in my grandfather's house, birds outside the window, and the sound of wood floors creaking like they were stretching after a long sleep. I painted the walls, fixed the old record player, even started cooking again, and every time I breathed in that old cedar air, it felt like the place itself was healing me. A few weeks passed before the first ripple reached me. A voicemail from Aunt Linda, her voice sharp with gossip. "Ryan, did you know your dad lost his job at the firm?" And I just stared at the phone, not because I was happy, but because I wasn't surprised. Dad had always been proud, arrogant even, convinced he could walk on water and everyone else should thank him for the puddles. Turns out his company discovered he'd been falsifying expense reports, a quiet scandal that cost him not just his job, but his reputation. I didn't say a word, didn't call, didn't laugh. I just poured myself coffee and went back to sanding the porch railing because life was finally balancing itself without my help. A few days later, another message came, this time from my cousin Sam. "Bro, Emily's engagement is off." And I almost dropped the mug. Apparently, her fiancé found out she'd been lying about money, saying she had a trust fund coming from Grandpa's estate. She didn't, of course, because Grandpa left everything to me, but she'd been bragging about it for months. And when her boyfriend realized she'd built a castle out of smoke, he walked out mid-dinner, left her crying in front of a restaurant full of people. I sat there on the porch, listening to the crickets, thinking about the night of that family party, how she'd smirked when they wished I didn't exist. And for the first time, I understood something Grandpa once told me. Karma doesn't need your help, just your patience. Within a week, Mom called. The first time in months, her voice shaky but still wrapped in authority. "Ryan, we need to talk." And I said, "About what?" And she said, "Don't be like this, it's family." And I said, "You made it clear family was optional." And she sighed. "We didn't mean it. You know how your father jokes." And I said, "I know exactly how he jokes. That's why I left." There was a long pause before she whispered, "We're in trouble. Your father lost his job. Your sister's engagement fell apart. We might lose the house." And I said, "I hope things work out." And she snapped, "Ryan, this isn't funny." And I said, "It's not supposed to be, Mom. It's life catching up." She started crying then. "Please, we need your help." And I just closed my eyes and said, "You said you wished I didn't exist, so start living like it." And hung up. My hands were shaking, not from guilt, but from release. Years of being the scapegoat burned off like fog in sunlight. Over the next few days, messages poured in, from relatives, from Emily, from everyone who once ignored me. "Ryan, can we talk? Please answer. We didn't mean it." And I stayed silent, because they'd built their lives around a fantasy where I was expendable, and now reality was collecting its debt. I focused on the house, on building something mine. Grandpa had left old journals, and reading them felt like finding pieces of myself in someone else's handwriting. He'd written about me, too, pages saying things like, "Ryan sees the world differently, but that's not a flaw. That's the gift this family never understood." And I cried then, quietly, the kind of tears that don't ask for pity, only peace. Around that time, I got another call from the lawyer. "Mr. Cole, the transfer of assets is complete." And I said, "All of them?" And he said, "Yes, including the financial accounts tied to the property. You're now the legal owner of everything." I thanked him and sat there staring at the old oak trees outside, realizing I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was free. Meanwhile, word spread fast. Relatives started calling, pretending to check in but really fishing for information. "We heard you inherited something from your grandfather." And I'd say, "Just memories." And they'd laugh nervously because rumors were already doing the rest. Within a month, my parents' situation got worse. Dad's debts surfaced. Mom's credit cards maxed out. Emily moved back home after losing her apartment, and every photo they posted online looked a little dimmer, smiles stretched thin like old elastic. I didn't need revenge. I just watched life do what it does best, equalize. One afternoon, I drove to the edge of town and stood outside their house, not to gloat, but to see if I felt anything. I didn't. The curtains were drawn, the yard overgrown, the mailbox stuffed with unpaid bills. For a second, I thought about knocking, maybe saying something, but then I remembered every time I'd stood outside that same house as a kid, waiting to be let in emotionally, and I realized I'd already done enough waiting for a lifetime. I turned around and drove home to Ashridge, where the air smelled like rain and redemption. That night, sitting by the fireplace Grandpa built himself, I raised a glass and said, "You were right again, old man." Because he'd told me once that people who wish you gone never expect to be left behind. And maybe that's the real revenge, not destruction, not cruelty, just absence so loud it echoes in their own guilt. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address, just my name in Mom's handwriting. Inside was a letter, trembling and uneven, saying, "We're sorry, Ryan. We didn't realize what we were doing until it was too late. Please come home." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it on the mantel beside Grandpa's photo. "This is home now," I whispered, and the house creaked softly like it agreed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing approval, I wasn't begging to belong. I just existed, whole, calm, unbothered. And somewhere out there, the family that once wished me gone was learning what it actually meant to live without me. A few months passed before the truth finally exploded like a storm no one saw coming. It started small. A post on Facebook from some distant cousin congratulating me on the beautiful Ashridge estate. Within hours, my phone lit up like a fire alarm. Missed calls from Mom, texts from Emily, even a voicemail from Dad, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Ryan, why didn't you tell us about the inheritance?" And then another, angrier. "That house was supposed to go to your sister." I laughed out loud, the kind of laugh that comes from years of being the punchline and finally getting the joke. By evening they were at my gate, all three of them, standing in the rain like a forgotten painting, Dad red-faced, Mom trembling, Emily clutching her phone like she could buy her way out of the past. "Open the door, Ryan," Mom shouted. "We just want to talk." And I said through the intercom, "You talked enough at the party." Dad barked, "This isn't fair. You manipulated him into leaving you everything." And I said, "I didn't have to manipulate him. He just saw what you refused to see." Emily stepped forward, voice sugar-sweet and venomous underneath. "Come on, you don't even like old houses. This isn't you." And I said, "Maybe you never knew me well enough to say that." Dad slammed his hand on the gate. "We're your family." And I said, "You made sure I forgot that years ago." The rain was pouring, thunder cracking behind them like applause from the universe itself. And for a moment, none of them spoke, just stood there, drenched, realizing they couldn't guilt their way in anymore. Then Mom whispered, "Please, we're sorry. We didn't mean it." And I said, "You meant it enough to say it in front of everyone." She started crying. "We've lost everything, Ryan." And I said, "No, you lost me. Everything else followed." Emily shouted, "You're cruel." And I said, "No, I'm finally honest." They stood there a moment longer before leaving, headlights vanishing down the road. and I stood watching until the dark swallowed them whole. That night, I couldn't sleep, not out of guilt, but because something in me felt lighter than air, like all the years of carrying their approval had finally burned away. But fate wasn't done yet. The next morning I got a call from Grandpa's lawyer again, his tone careful. "Mr. Cole, there's one last thing your grandfather wanted you to know." I frowned. "What is it?" And he said, "He left a sealed letter for your parents too, but he instructed me to deliver it only if they ever came to you asking for help." My heart skipped. "You mean now?" And he said, "Exactly." He emailed me a scan and said, "It's your choice whether to send it." I opened it and read Grandpa's handwriting, shaky but strong. "To my son and his wife. If you're reading this, then you've finally learned that love cannot be withdrawn like money from a bank. You spent years hoarding affection and investing only in perfection, forgetting that real family is built on forgiveness, not favoritism. I left the house to Ryan because he earned it, not through success, but through survival. You have everything you ever wanted, except the one thing you threw away, him. If you want him back, start by apologizing to yourselves." I stared at those words, tears pricking my eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of truth that spanned generations. I sent the letter, not out of revenge, but because I wanted them to feel what honesty sounds like when it's written in love they never understood. Days passed, silence again, until one evening, there was a knock, soft, hesitant, and when I opened the door, Emily was standing there alone, eyes swollen, makeup ruined, holding that same letter. "He loved you more than anyone," she said, voice breaking. "We all knew it, and we hated you for it because we wanted it too." I didn't speak. I just listened as she cried. "Dad's sick, Mom can't sleep, the house is gone, and all we do is talk about you." And I said, "Now you know what it feels like to be the one they talk about, but never talk to." She whispered, "Please, can we start over?" And I said, "You remember that day at the party when you smirked?" And she nodded, "Yes." And I said, "That was the moment I stopped needing a family. So no, we can't start over, but maybe we can stop pretending." She looked like she wanted to say more, but just nodded and left, the sound of gravel crunching under her shoes fading into the rain. I closed the door, leaned against it, and realized I didn't hate her anymore, because hate is just love that stayed too long in pain. A week later, I got a letter from my parents, short and shaky. "We're sorry. You were always enough. We hope you find peace, even if it's not with us." I folded it, put it beside Grandpa's photo, and said, "I already did." Months rolled by, and word around town spread. My parents moved away, Emily found work in another city, and I stayed in Ashridge, renovating the house, building something real from the wreckage of false love. People sometimes ask if I ever forgave them, and the truth is yes. But forgiveness isn't an open door, it's just the act of dropping the key and walking away. Then came the twist no one saw coming. A year later, I got another letter from the lawyer, final update to the estate. It said, "Your grandfather had one last condition. Upon your death, the property will transfer not to your family, but to a local orphan charity foundation under your name." I laughed, loud and free, because it was perfect, a legacy not of bitterness, but of breaking the cycle. I walked outside, the sun setting over the trees, and whispered, "You did it, old man." Because somehow he'd written the ending before I ever lived it. My family got their wish once, to live without me, and it destroyed them. Now they'd have to live with the knowledge that the son they cast aside turned his pain into something that would outlive them all. I locked the gate that night, not in anger but in peace, knowing the house no longer carried the weight of our history, only the proof that even the unwanted can become unforgettable. And if anyone ever asks me whether revenge feels good, I'll tell them this. It doesn't. Not really, but freedom does. And sometimes they look the same when you finally stop bleeding. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.